It has been a big week for protests across at least a dozen university campuses in the United States. Elite universities such as Columbia, Yale and NYU have all held pro-Palestinian demonstrations this week, especially on Monday, as tensions continue to rise over the war in Gaza. These protests have resulted in hundreds of arrests across all campuses, as well as university officials either telling students to work remotely or to blatantly avoid campuses for fear of anti-Semitism. Protesters are not only calling for an end to the Israel-Hamas war, but for universities to stop investment in companies that profit Israel. Now, these protests have caused division across the country since October 7, as it calls into question whether students are allowed to exercise their free speech, it acknowledging the suffering of Palestinians should end immediately. However, these protests have also caused an unsafe environment for Jewish students and staff who have been subjected to anti-Semitism. While some universities were in discussions with students over how best to reach an agreement to end the demonstrations, NYU faculty weren't having any of it, telling police to arrest any of its own students, faculty, staff, and anyone who dares to stand in solidarity with Palestine. Let's take a look at some of the protests across the last week.
So honored to be joined by the resistance.
Yo, remember
you fucking piece of shit.
Wait, remember the 7th of October.
Never forget the 7th of October.
That will happen.
Never forget the 7th of October.
Not one more time. Not 5 more times. Not 10 more times. Not 100 more times. Not 1,000 more times.
No,
but 10,000 times.
Viva, viva Palestina! Free, free, free Palestine!
Free Palestine!
Within our lifetime!
We will free Palestine!
We will free Palestine!
Within our lifetime!
Within our lifetime! There is only one solution! Intifada revolution! There is only one solution! Intifada revolution!
The situation is tense as the Biden administration continues to give Israel its full backing. In fact, the US Senate finally, after months of deliberation, signed off on nearly $24 billion in foreign aid to be sent to the war-torn country. While Joe Biden has remained relatively silent on the protests, he did condemn them when he was asked earlier in the week on Earth Day.
Do you condemn the anti-Semitic protests on college campuses?
I condemn the anti-Semitic protests. That's why I've set up a program to deal with that. I also condemn those who don't understand what's going on with the Palestinians.
But just like clockwork, New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez copped criticism for her stance on the situation. AOC is part of the small group of progressive Democrats who have pushed back on the pro-Israel agenda since October 7. She is now under scrutiny for calling the university protests peaceful. Her tweet read, "Calling in police enforcement on non-violent demonstrations of young students on campus is an escalatory, reckless and dangerous act. It represents a heinous failure of leadership that puts people's lives at risk. I condemn it in the strongest possible terms."
I'm a complete free speech advocate. I think people should be able to say basically whatever they want within reason, as long as it's legal. With regards to protests, I do feel the same way, as long as they are peaceful. This, however, is not peaceful. Under any example of the imagination, my niece goes to Cal Berkeley in California, which is one of the schools that, the encampment started yesterday, just like the other few big ones are Yale, Columbia, NYU, you know, we've seen them all across the country. These are not some students that lean a bit left or that are anti-war, perhaps like we saw in the 60s. These are incredibly, incredibly well-organized, and might I add, well-funded protests that are far beyond, you know, the very sad issue of dead Palestinians, dead Israelis. You know, it would be wonderful if people were doing these peaceful protests for altruistic reasons, but unfortunately, it's that is not what's going on in the moment. So AOC coming out and tweeting what she did is incredibly out of touch. It reminds me a little bit of the summer of 2020, where you had, I think it was the guy on CNN, and, you know, mostly peaceful protests, and then there's firebombs going off behind him. So again, protesting, yes, we all need to fight for our right to be able to continue to do that, but that's not what's going on here. And I think what a lot of people are starting to ask is, how did we get here?
AOC calling the protests peaceful despite students being told not to return to unsafe campuses has seen the Congresswoman scolded yet again.
It's an odd statement considering Columbia is so concerned about safety, it is mandating remote learning. A rabbi at Columbia told students to go home because, quote, the school cannot guarantee your safety, prompting common sense to wonder why students need a safety guarantee during peaceful protests. And a Jewish professor at Columbia who tried to lead a pro-Jewish rally is now banned from campus. Again, Columbia is citing safety, which brings common sense back to the AOCs of logic.
This is insane. And the fact that, you know, the idea that both political leaders and college campus leaders don't react with absolute ferocity to put this down, I think shows the incredible spot we are in, both politically and academically, in America today.
The Democratic Congresswoman's tweet received a few critical replies as well. One person wrote, "They are explicitly inciting violence, engaging in radical hatred and impeding students and faculty for learning and teaching. The only heinous failure in leadership is your justification of the behaviour." Another wrote, "Protesters physically blocking students from attending their school is an escalatory, reckless and dangerous act, like Nazis did. It represents a heinous failure of understanding that puts people's lives at risk. I condemn pro-Hamas extremists in the strongest possible terms. And for the sake of this country, please resign." And finally, I think a racist invasion of fascists like these Hamas loyalists is exactly when you need to call in the police.